All right, so chapter 12 focuses on these three things: urbanization, population growth, and migration. On that note, there are three most important points, one for each of those three. Regarding urbanization, it's that in pre-Columbian times, Native Americans already had large cities. Some of the largest cities in the world were in the Americas. And again, going back to day one, that is a change from our own single stories about Native Americans. With regard to population growth, is that it took almost 400 years. I think it's 375. Almost 400 years to recover from the population loss that resulted from contact and conquest and colonization. And with regard to migration, the number one form of migration in Latin America is from rural to urban, also referred to as interregional flows. All right, the major pre-Columbian urban centers. So again, they're in Mesoamerica and the Andes. What are the homework question asked? What were the three largest? They would be Tenochtitlan at 200 to 250,000. Teotihuacan from 85 to 200,000. Chan Chan is one we haven't talked about with over 100,000. And if we were to add a fourth to the three that were asked for in homework, it would be Tikal at 60,000. A number of students mentioned Tajín, and I see Tajín there, but I'm not sure why. I don't think Clawson specifically addressed it at all, so I'm not sure why students brought it up. Yes, he did. Okay. Hmm? Yeah, no, yeah, if you get a chance to let me know where, maybe after class, might be helpful, because I didn't see it, huh? Yeah, I'm looking there. And I don't see it, so. But yeah, we can, like I said, after class, you can help me find it. All right, so we've learned about Tenochtitlan and Teotihuacan before. We haven't learned, and we've brought up Tikal as well, but in the class, we haven't talked about Chan Chan before. So I'll talk about that just a little bit. Chan Chan had over 100,000 people, was at its height for almost 500 years. It was in ancient Peru, and it was the largest city in South America. And here's pictures of what it looks like, kind of the remains, and then what it looked like at its height. This is something we've also touched on before, but it connects to the idea of urbanization, and it gets brought up in this chapter. What's the oldest continuously occupied community in what is now the United States? It has to do with the Anasazi and their descendants. The Acoma Pueblo and Taos Pueblo, New Mexico. These are communities that have been continuously inhabited for almost 1,000 years. And it's also a reminder that Native Americans had communities that, been continuously occupied or inhabited prior to the arrival of Europeans. Now looking at Europeans, what's the first city founded by Europeans in America? Well, a reminder that in this class, America is not just the United States. And for most of you, this wasn't an issue in your homework, where the first one was Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, second, San Juan, Puerto Rico, third, Havana, Cuba. There were a number of students who got the first two correctly, and then the third one would be off. Now, the oldest continuously inhabited settlement, founded by Europeans in what is now the United States. There we get to Florida, specifically St. Augustine, Florida. Then Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Jamestown, Virginia were being founded around at about the same time by the Spanish and the English. And then eventually we get in 1620 to Plymouth Rock, the one we identify with the most in US history. In the homework asks you to distinguish two of the five categories of early colonial cities. So there's agricultural cities that are the most common. There's mining cities that tend to go boom and bust, as mines do. Then you were asked to distinguish between industrial cities and commercial cities, because those are the most similar of the five, and I wanted you to be able to distinguish one from the other. Industrial cities, had to do with, how do I put it? Industrial cities tended to exist because they would get monopolies or subsidies to make or to sell something. Commercial cities, they tended to exist because of their location, because they were at a key location for commerce. And so they might be at the mouth of a river. They might be at kind of at the peak of a mountain or at the base of a mountain, so they're just at a key location. And then administrative cities is where they would have the administration for the viceroyalties is the word I was trying to think of, that eventually become capitals of countries. So Havana, Cuba. Okay, ejidos. Ejidos was not an issue. Many of you wrote that it was communal land used for grazing. What this is introducing here is the concept that, there's the town, the small town, and then there is the ejido surrounding the town. There'd be a road leading to the town and going through it. And then there were the larger landowners who would have their own private land. But with time, as these towns grew, the ejidos got, eaten up by the growing town, and there was less of it by what eventually becomes an urban zone. So then there's less ejido left. Plazas, not an issue for most of you, where the purpose is for socializing. Now, more specifically, it's very common for the city hall, which they call Palacio Municipal, to be on one side of the plaza, the church of the town to be on the other side of the plaza, and then having commercial buildings there as well. And again, I think I mentioned this before, but this might be a good opportunity to bring it up again. This historically is a credit that has not been given, but there's evidence to believe that this grid pattern of cities is actually something that was learned from Native American communities, specifically the Aztecs, specifically the city of Tenochtitlan, that then got applied in other parts of the world. If you look at old European cities, they did not look like grids. It's after that that new places start being built that way. Some pictures of some plazas. Here's one in Costa Rica. Here's one in Mexico. This is the one from my parents' hometown in Juchitlan, Jalisco, Mexico. Jalisco is a state from where everything stereotypical about Mexico comes from. So tequila and mariachi music. I'm forgetting, right now, one of the biggest drug cartels, all, the stereotypes of Mexico are kind of real in Jalisco, yes.
Do you know why that is, as opposed to like?
Why, what is?
So many of the stereotypes come from that region, is it like particularly populous or?
Yeah, so why is it? I think that it could be because it was the second largest city. Now it might be second or third, sort of the second largest cities in Jalisco. And for the people of the capital of Mexico City, they make up almost 20% of the population of the country. So for people that are from Mexico City, and I'd say there's a lot of parallels with New York City, the people that live in Mexico City tend to think of themselves as like the only urban people in the country. And so they think of Jalisco and it's the second biggest city, Guadalajara, as they would call it being provincial. It's their way of saying that it's kind of like a cute little place with culture. And so, yeah, I think it's my guess would be that it has to do with the city of Guadalajara and its unique culture and history, but also where it stood in the middle of the 20th century when they were trying to come up with, okay, how do we sell Mexico to tourists? And they just happen to pick Jalisco and its traditions to represent the country. But yeah, for Mexicans, it's kind of like, I don't know. It's kind of like if New Yorkers think they're the center of the world, and people in other states of the United States feel like foreigners think we're all like Texans, or we're all like people from LA, or we're all like people from New York City, and they're like, yeah, we're not all like that. And so I think Jalisco plays a similar role. Here we get to the rebound of the population in Latin America, where around the time of contact, it was a little over 50 million based on this estimate. And then it gets back to a little over 50 million around, what would it be, like 1875? And so it'd be about 375 years maybe a little more, before it gets back to that point of being over 50 million. So it takes about 375 years or almost 400 years to rebound from contact, conquest, and colonization, but it's also continued to grow exponentially. All right, we get introduced to the demographic transition model. Good job, most of you doing a good job of explaining the model when it doesn't seem that easy to explain, but I'm glad to see a lot of students got it. And it also correlates with this idea of countries, especially in the 20th century, transitioning from being predominantly rural to becoming predominantly urban. The United States itself went through that transition in the 1940s. And in many parts of Latin America, they went through that transition a generation later, say like in the 1960s. And so this is saying stage one is when a country is predominantly rural. And at that point, it tends to have a high birth rate and a high death rate. And they balance each other out so that there's population stability. Stage two is when a country starts becoming urban, when people start moving to cities. The birth rate stays high, but the death rate declines. And so people in cities tend to have better access to healthcare and to other important things like the infrastructure, sanitation, etc. And so with still having a high birth rate and the death rate going down, then the rate of population growth goes up. And this also connects to, if you think of, we live in an area of the country and the state that is surrounded by rural areas. And so I can imagine many of us can come up with examples of families that, even though they're your families maybe used to have farms, but now live in cities. And you might be able to point to, say, your grandparents, when they used to have 6 kids, 8 kids, and it was very common. And then now your parents are more likely to have had 1, 2, or 3, but not 6 or 8 or 10, like previous generations. And so that is what, again, this can be applied worldwide, not just to Latin America. In stage 3, when the birth rate starts going down, and that has to do with the longer people are in cities, the more they acclimate or change their way of living, where they don't have as many children, or in general, people have less children. And so Latin America, according to Clawson, would be in stage 3, and pretty soon will be in stage 4, where they have a low death rate and a low birth rate, and there's there'll be an end to this exponential growth that happened in the second half of the 20th century. Yep, and so again, here's just Latin America becoming more and more urban, less and less rural. Again, for the US, this happens in the 1940s. For Latin America, looks like maybe a little after 1960, that it tips over from being more rural, to becoming more urban. We talked about the Ford model of the Latin American city structure. What I didn't talk about earlier is just how this is an outgrowth of that earlier, town where people lived, surrounding the plaza. Once it grows into a big city, that plaza will still be there a lot of the time. But that downtown will become the market, will become the central business district. The wealthy people of the town, used to live like in downtown. But by the time it becomes a big city, they instead live around the spine, the main boulevard where all the fancy stores are, and also leading to the fancy mall or the fancy stores. And, again, we see some of this in the United States as well, where it's not uncommon for mortgages or rent to be very expensive in cities. And so there'll be a lot of people that will commute. They'll buy property outside the city where it costs less and commute into the city for work, and then back out to the suburbs to live. And so this is very similar, where poor people will live on the outskirts, commute into the city to work, and then commute back out to where they can afford to live. Here's some pictures of Mexico's spine. It's a boulevard called Paseo de la Reforma. A picture from the 70s, from the 2010s, and I took this picture in 2017 of their Angel of Independence, which is kind of like their, I don't know, it's kind of like it's an important symbol in Mexico, similar to how important the Statue of Liberty is to the United States. Megalopoli. This is when cities become so large that they start becoming like a city of cities. I would think Los Angeles would be an example of this. We might refer to this more commonly as a metropolitan area, where a city gets so large that it starts connecting with the next largest city, and then you don't have any in between cities. You just go from city to city to city. They're all interconnected. And the biggest megalopoli, the biggest metropolitan areas around Mexico City, in Brazil, around Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, and then in Argentina and Uruguay, around Buenos Aires. Squatter settlements. So this is, I think, what is popularly imagined when we think of a squatter settlement. And so along with that is these misconceptions that they're disorganized, that migrants are the people who live there, that they're unemployed, and that they're criminals. But what Clawson introduced us to in this chapter is that a lot of these squatter settlements are actually pretty well planned. And that there's these three important players in the creation of them. There's politicians. Politicians will actually support these squatter settlements because they want voters. They want people to vote for them. And so they'll tell this squatter settlement, remember who helped you legitimize this new squatter settlement, and vote for me when it's time to vote. Or, if it's already an established squatter settlement, they'll be like, remember who's the person who brought sidewalks or indoor plumbing or electricity or whatever it is the squatter settlement needs, vote for me. There's the owner of the land, which can be counterintuitive for us. Why would the owner of the land want people to show up and squat on their land and call it theirs? Seems counterintuitive. But the owner might own a lot of land, and in the outskirts of the city, and might be ready to cash in. And if they get, they can designate the least desirable part of their land for squatters. And once there's a squatter settlement, they can then get the government to bring in roads, bring in indoor plumbing, bring electricity, bring telephone lines, whatever, bring in the infrastructure that is gonna raise the value of this landowner's property. Not to mention, they'll also ask the government to pay them for the land that they lost to the squatters. So it's kind of a win-win for them. The government pays them for the land they lost when they recognize the squatter settlement, and the rest of their land gets infrastructure and higher property values. And professional squatters. They're basically like squatter real estate agents who helped plan the whole thing. Like I said, on July 3rd, we're gonna have 50 people show up. Do you want lot number 25? Do you want lot 45? I'm gonna plan the whole thing. And on July 3rd, we're all gonna show up in the middle of the night, claim our new block, and we're gonna call it whatever, Liberty Heights. And the Hope of America Avenue is gonna be the main street and whatever. Next morning, they call a press conference, look at all these cute faces. How can you say no to them? To Liberty Heights on 4th of July. How un-American of you. And so it's this whole orchestrated thing to make them happen. But you might notice that a lot of these places that are referred to as squatter settlements, or in the case of Brazil, favelas, they don't look like this. These are substantial. These are not gonna get blown away with a little wind or a storm. Here's in Mexico City, picture from 10 years ago. Now, there are cities in Latin America that have huge percentages of their population living in what Clawson would refer to as squatter settlements, like Mexico City having the most. This was not an issue. You talked about Brasilia, the new capital of Brazil. And then we get to the immigration, where we learned that interregional flows are the most common throughout the 20th century, sort of from moving from rural areas to urban areas. With that said, the United States is the one country that receives the largest number of Latin American immigrants than any other country. With that said, it's not only to the United States. They move to other Latin American countries, and then they also move to other parts of the world. Like there's a connection in the Andes, especially Peru, to Japan, people going to Great Britain, people going to Europe in general, France. There's a significant Latin American population in Spain. But the US is the one country that does receive the most. Just Japanese colony in Bolivia or Brazil, close to Bolivia.